Welcome to episode 126 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 20 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel. But before we get started, just an apology to our viewers and listeners. Anshel was at ReInvent. He plans to talk about that as his first topic today. And I was in the Baltic region in Latvia, Riga, Latvia, the capital of Latvia, for 5G Techritory. So I was on the other side of the world. And so that's why we didn't have an episode last week, and we're recording early this week. But let me get into to my first topic. I want to talk about 5G Techritory. I know that may sound like it doesn't roll off the tongue that easily, but this event, this was the 5th year the event was held. Obviously, during the pandemic, they went to a virtual event. I've been a part of this event since its inception. Patrick, our chief analyst, he jokes often and asks me, when am I getting the key to Riga, Latvia? And I'm still working on that. I actually asked the Techritory team this week if that was ready. But long and the short of it, this event started out as sort of a niche event in the Baltic region. The Baltics are obviously very close to the Russian border. They share a border with Russia. But none of that was center stage. Really, what this event was focused on is really 5G and use cases. And the sponsors are quite impressive for this event. Nokia and Cisco were among many of the sponsors. And what I really like about this event is that it's very practical. They focus on specific 5G use cases to really highlight the disruptive potential for 5G. Like in years past, I was asked to moderate panels, so I moderated 2. I moderated one around the debate with respect to over-the-tops and the potential for needed legislation in the European Union to sort of level the playing field. But there are lots of complicated issues here with net neutrality and that sort of thing. But it was a spirited panel. We had a spirited Q&A. But at the end of the day, my conclusion in a Forbes article that I wrote just last week, so hit my Twitter feed if you're interested. I summarized the 2 panels that I moderated here at this event. But at the end of the day, legislation, especially when it comes to net neutrality, could stifle innovation and be counterproductive to what needs to be accomplished. And so clearly in this panel, we had Sky UK. They're a huge content streaming service that many people are familiar with, and Meta was also a part of this panel. And they really talked about the investments that they're making in edge enablement, caching, CDN networks and that sort of thing, to offload a lot of that load on the network. So I found that quite compelling. And then the second panel I moderated was around accessibility. And I think, as our viewers and listeners know, I'm very passionate about the digital divide. I'm working on my first book. I'll be traveling to 4 different parts of the world next year, finally, post-pandemic, to write this travelogue. But what this panel focused on was the disabled, both permanently disabled and temporarily disabled people, and what needs to be done to drive inclusion. And so actually in Europe, there's something called the European Accessibility Act. And part of that scope is around ensuring digital inclusion for people. And so I'll stop short of summarizing that. But again, I did publish a Forbes article last Friday, and that contains all of my feedback. But again, this event, it's been a niche event, but it's really kind of stepping out of the shadows of some of the larger events like the Mobile World Congress series. And it's really becoming really a key event in Europe in particular. But with that, I know you want to talk about reInvent. Unfortunately, I did get the invite, but I was halfway around the world. But why don't you share some insights that you found interesting?
Yeah, I was able to attend reInvent in person. And this was actually my first reInvent. And it happens every year this time in December.
Yeah.
And I actually attended it because of multiple areas that I cover, including 5G. I also covered some of the gaming stuff, as well as some of the immersive and spatial computing stuff. But we're going to focus mostly on 5G stuff. So this was not necessarily a reInvent announcement, but it's reInvent and AWS adjacent and relevant. That being that Vodafone announced their Edge Innovation Lab, which is in partnership with Kyndryl, and they basically opened this, in England, and they were dedicated this mech server application with AWS, and they already have some mech zones in Manchester as part of their wavelength infrastructure. So they're definitely getting more aggressive on mech in the UK with AWS. And then there was also a JMA announcement that they would be deploying their 5G XRAN solution on AWS's Elastic Kubernetes service, also known as EKS. And they also talked about how their XRAN solution is cloud native and uses CBRS to achieve up to a gigabit per second of throughput. So this is, a big deal. JMA, as you know, is a pretty big player in the space.
They are.
And this is a good win for AWS in terms of helping them to deploy more rapidly and potentially save costs for their customers. And then the other was with Intel on Intel's FlexRAN that they were working on using the same EKS service and validating Intel's FlexRAN for that use case. So those were like the biggest announcements. But there was also a Deutsche Telekom announcement around Amazon's external key management service as well. So, these are like, not necessarily the most exciting announcements.
Right.
But I think they're also very crucial in enabling Amazon's customers to enable the CSPs to deploy 5G RAN in the cloud. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on these announcements.
Yeah, just one comment, and thank you for attending on my behalf since I had the conflict there. But I continue to be impressed with Vodafone. They're trying new things. Certainly, when you look at the carrier investment, AT&T in particular, and Verizon, the investment they're making with the hyperscalers, AWS and Azure, to edgify their networks. We're beginning to see that happen in Europe, and really Vodafone is the first. Vodafone is also very aggressively embracing Open RAN. So I believe that we'll continue to see other operators in Europe sort of follow suit with Vodafone and edgify their networks, like we've seen many of the US operators do as well. But again, I think Vodafone is someone to watch. They try a lot of things. They're not always successful, but I give them a lot of kudos and credit for at least putting themselves out there and sort of being bleeding edge in a European market that's very challenging, because I was just over there. I mean, all of these countries that speak these different languages that are all close to one another have different approaches to how they manage spectrum auctions and how they're deploying 5G and how they're trying to figure out the roaming agreements and that sort of thing. So the European Union is inherently a much more complex geography for the deployment of 5G, and that's why I think it's been a little slower and behind the US. But things like the Vodafone announcement are encouraging there. But let me move to my second topic this week, and I caught this news about Bharti Airtel and Meta. They're partnering together to extend a subsea cable to India, and it got me thinking, what does this mean exactly for Bharti Airtel's 5G deployment? So the details are to Africa. The number 2 Africa is the subsea cable system, and then what Airtel and Meta are doing is they're extending that current infrastructure with something called 2 Africa Pearls, which basically is going to connect the other end within the city of Mumbai. And from my perspective, the operators need additional capacity for backhaul for 5G deployment. And so I think for Bharti Airtel, there's certainly a significant mobile network operator in India, but we often talk about Reliance and their investment and how aggressive they are in their desire to ubiquitously cover the country of India with 5G. And I think this is a great move for Bharti. I mean, partnering with Meta, Facebook is no stranger to this. Facebook was involved with the telecom project for many years, and they were really focused on extending connectivity to underserved areas. And obviously that was to drive, usage and, adoption of their platforms and their applications, whether it's Facebook or or the metaverse. But I think this is a strong, opportunity for Bharti to really, push their 5G deployment in India. But I don't know if you have any further feedback you want to add there.
I don't really have any particular insights that what I would consider unique.
Yeah,
But I would also say, just to add, that I think India is going to need as much bandwidth as it can get.
agree.
All the projections that we're seeing with 5G use cases and 5G data consumption, it's anywhere in the ballpark of 5 to 10x in the next few years. So I think they're going to need every ounce of data they can get coming from whatever sources they can get it from.
I agree. And when you look at the population of India as well, they're going to have more people on the networks, and it's going to be putting more load and more stress on those networks. So, you absolutely you never have enough capacity from my perspective. But let's move to your second topic this week, and I caught this as well. Ericsson published its mobility report for November, and you want to provide some insights from that.
Yeah, so there are a lot of insights in there. Ericsson does a very good job with this report. I actually have it open as I'm speaking with you right now.
Yeah.
And the really big ones that I think, reverberated within the industry, were their forecasts for the end of this year. They are expecting a total of 1 billion 5G users by the end of this year. And 100 million fixed wireless customers by the end of this year.
Wow.
And they also expect that number to grow to 300 million by 2028. So a considerable number of, total user consumption of fixed wireless is going to grow considerably. That said, there will be billions of other connections between 4G and 5G.
Yeah.
But I think the expectation is that this is kind of their forecast for 2028. And there's a lot of interesting numbers out there, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on these numbers as well.
Well, the 5G number doesn't surprise me, but the projection for FWA does, because I've gotten asked this question from a number of clients, in general, around, what I really believe the true market size is for fixed wireless access 5G services. And I'm going to spend a little more time because I'm getting back from this European trip and getting caught up on sleep and jet lag. But just initially, that number, I don't know if you feel the same way, but that number seems a little high to me. But again, I want to dig into that report and understand that a little bit more.
Yeah, it seems like they are incorporating, 4G and 5G together as one.
Oh,
You have
okay,
to think
that
about
makes
all of
sense.
the 4G connections that are still FWA. And that is over 100 million. If you look at the graph, I can't show the graph because I don't have that ability to do that right now, but I can try and see if it works. But basically, the way I look at it is, it's not really, able to make a huge difference. Actually, I can do it right here. So as you see it right here, the purple lines are not really, the dark purple is 5G and the light purple
Got
is,
it. Okay.
yeah, it's a pretty big difference. So 5G probably won't surpass 4G in terms of FWA until about 2025.
Right.
And that's when they hit 200 million. So it becomes an even split. But yeah, that's kind of the ethos behind that 100 million number, which is still, if without 5G, that number wouldn't be possible until 2024. So I still think, overall, that 300 million number still incorporates 50 some million in 4G still existing. So I think we're still very much looking at 4G growth. It looks like 4G FWA will continue to grow until 2024, which is when it hits 100 million. And I think that's fair when you think about how many countries are still going to be rolling out 5G networks up into 2024. And if you look at like the topology, let's say even Verizon and AT&T, they're not going to have their mid-band networks really fully rolled out until 2024. And even T-Mobile has a lot of spectrum that they're going to be getting in 2024. So I think this is a fairly reasonable projection when you incorporate 4G.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, highly detailed, and let's make sure we include the link when we post the podcast this week for sure. But let me hit my third and final topic this week, and I want to talk about Verizon. And they recently had an executive depart, and it was actually their consumer group CEO, Manon Brule. She stepped down after less than a year, and then Hans Vestberg, the CEO, announced that he would be assuming her responsibilities. So, I mean, I don't want to read anything, in the tea leaves here, but Verizon's had, some stumbles and, in recent, time with not only financials, but just, deploying its 5G network. Obviously, it probably has the biggest gap to overcome. We've talked about in the past with respect to building out its mid-band spectrum assets, right, to support 5G just beyond its ultra wideband millimeter wave service. But the optics on this don't feel great, So I don't know. Am I reading too much into it? I'd love to get your insight.
I think it doesn't look good at all. But I also know that Vodafone Group's CEO also stepped down.
I saw that.
And that they will have the CFO take his place. So and she's the CFO, so like that's very much a similar kind of scenario where it sounds like both of these departures were not necessarily planned.
Right.
And when you think about that, having a planned succession is important for such a large company. I think Verizon has a lot of problems. And I think replacing her will not really solve them. I think a lot of Verizon's problems I believe come from the board level, because these executives for the most part are chosen by the board. So if they're choosing people that can't even stay a year, that's not really a good look on the board. And Hans can only do so much. I think a lot of people were very excited to see Hans Vestberg join the company, but operators I like to call them tankers. They're like very slow moving ships. And it takes a lot of tugboats to get them to change direction, or many miles or many, years to move. So I think Verizon is on a good path to change, and to becoming a competitive carrier again. But I think the last few years have really damaged their reputation with customers. And I think, they're leaning into millimeter wave, really hurt them. They could have talked about 5G in a different way. And I think that they overhyped it. And I think they hurt themselves by doing so. And I think they've also hurt the 5G market sentiment overall, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I agree. And they are on the right path. I mean, they're doing all the right things. I mean, they're deploying their C-band, mid-band, assets. And that's, as you and I predicted, that was going to take them, a pretty good amount of time. And just, the profile of that spectrum requires, densification. And we've talked about that as well. But they are on that path. But, again, we may see additional executive departures and consolidations, within Verizon going forward. But with that said, let's hit your third and final topic this week. And you want to talk about Deutsche Telekom and some claims that they recently made about 5G coverage in Germany.
Yeah, so they recently announced, I think this was a few days ago, that their 5G network now covers 94% of the German population, which is actually quite impressive when you consider how big Germany is. And how many people live in Germany. And I think they really have demonstrated how well they can roll out this network and get the spectrum that they need to make it possible.
Yeah. What I find impressive, so when I was over in Europe, I always have an opportunity to kind of pick the brains of the folks that live in Europe. And One of the things that I learned is that right now, economically speaking, Germany is the most prosperous country within the European Union. And that's no surprise when you look at the diversification of their industry and that sort of thing, and certainly the luxury car segment that the Germans dominate there. And I'm not surprised to see that they're claiming this sort of coverage because we're hearing news from all of the major German automobile manufacturers and how they are going to aggressively lean into 5G to fully automate their manufacturing operations so that they can, do things, from a quality control perspective and improve efficiency. And, my middle name is Seifert, so I have some German heritage in my family. And the Germans are always very focused on the precise nature of what they're doing. And really 5G can really bring a lot of disruption into the automobile manufacturing arena with smart manufacturing and that sort of thing. So I'm not surprised to see this. And, it's something that Deutsche Telekom continues to lean into from a private wireless perspective. So,
and I was just going to add some more statistics. This is kind of from a release that they gave out. They said they expect to hit 99% of the population by 2025.
Mm-hmm.
They said that they have 80,000 antennas currently transmitting 5G, of which 8,000 will be providing 5G in the 3.6 gigahertz band by the end of the year, which is mid-band. They also said that they have 5G in 700, 2.1, and 3.6 gigahertz, and that their 2.1 is technically available for standalone. And then what else do I see here? That 700 megahertz is probably doing the real heavy lifting on that coverage number.
For coverage, yeah.
And they're talking about fiber as well, and how they're trying to add 2 more million households by the end of the year as well. And they want to increase their overall fiber reach to a total of 5.2 million customers by the end of this year. So they're also pushing on fiber while they're also pushing 5G, which sounds very much like an AT&T strategy.
It sure does.
But it's really interesting to see how Deutsche Telekom is kind of like a hybrid approach between T-Mobile and AT&T, where they've built this coverage layer, but they also are working on mid-band, and they're also working on fiber simultaneously. But it's not a huge surprise. Deutsche Telekom is, I think, either a majority owner of T-Mobile or almost a majority owner of T-Mobile US. And I think, AT&T strategy is pretty solid as well. So it's just been really interesting to see how well Deutsche Telekom is doing. And hopefully I'll be able to go to Germany next year and experience the network for myself.
Yeah, and I'm hoping to get over there as well. There's an opportunity that might bring me there. But from my perspective, DT is doing everything right. I mean, they've got the right approach with Spectrum. They're doing all the right things from my perspective, from a monetization standpoint. And it's an impressive stat, and kind of based on everything that you were able to cite there, I think that absolutely backs up their claim that they're hitting the majority of coverage in Germany there. But hey, bud, it's been another great podcast. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide insights on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at WillTownTech, and I'm at Anshel. We hope you have a great rest of your week, and please tune in again next week.